All right, let's get started. Welcome, everybody. This is Panama Bartholomew with the Building Decarbonization Coalition, and thank you for joining us for our Title 24 2022 Building Code Update webinar. I'm joined by just a fantastic team of Rachel Golden from the Sierra Club and Ted Tiffany from Gutman and Blavatwet, who are going to help me with the presentation today. Today, what we're going to be doing is the first in a series of webinars and pieces of outreach that we're going to do around the 2022 update to Title 24. We're going to give you an update on the update process, where we're at, some of the issues that are key for building decarbonization, and then provide some suggestions to the building decarbonization community about potential areas where you may want to provide input and help you provide input into the Energy Commission's process. So thank you for joining. Folks are coming in. We had about 80 folks registered for the webinar, and so I'm going to get started and just provide a little bit of a background on the Building Decarbonization Coalition as other folks join in. The Building Decarbonization Coalition is a nonprofit group representing energy providers, manufacturers, the building design and construction and real estate communities, local governments, and NGOs. We have about 150 members that are all working collaboratively on eliminating greenhouse gas emissions from the built environment through both policy and market mechanisms. We adopted a roadmap in January of 2019 that really guide our efforts along this path. And out of that roadmap, we adopted on a consensus basis some key goals that we have by 2025 a zero emissions building code for residential buildings in California, by 2028 a zero emissions building code for commercial buildings, that through retrofit programs at the state and local level, we get to 100% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions from the built environment by 2045, and that by 2030, all of our space heating and water heating equipment sold in California is all high efficiency, all electric. And out of that roadmap, we adopted 5 major goals that we're going to have to follow in order to be able to achieve this. We have to significantly increase awareness around building electrification and its benefits. We need to make sure that customers are receiving a good value, both from the upfront costs as well as the ongoing use of electrification technologies. We need to make sure that builders and contractors have a value proposition. They're making at least as much, if not more money, installing electric equipment rather than natural gas. And we need to be working with the supply chains and manufacturers to reduce and remove barriers and get them up to speed to be able to significantly ramp up. And then lastly, we need to align all of our state and local policies in order to meet these other goals. And that's where this webinar comes in. And so out of these goals, the Building Decarbonization Coalition does a number of different initiatives and activities. One of them is webinars like this, and this one would fall under how do we seek to work together in order to affect change on our policies to be able to align them with our decarbonization goals in the state. I want to bring up just a few upcoming events the coalition is going to host. We're having a Grid Integrating Buildings 2-day summit in Oakland, November 12th and 13th, where we're going to be digging into the issues of electrical panels and electrical panel upgrade needs, as well as the impact of building electrification on the electrical distribution network at the neighborhood level. And so we're going to have 2 days, just 2 fantastic days of some of the thought leaders and practitioners in this space to delve into what are the problems and some of the solutions that are emerging around this. Then the very next day on the 14th, we're going to have a great webinar as part of our Building Decarbonization Coalition Presents Getting Off Gas with E3's Amber Mahone, and she's going to be going over E3's new report about natural gas distribution in California's climate future. So a fantastic report that's looking into some of the issues around how do we meet our climate goals and effectively wind down the natural gas system in a responsible way. And then lastly, I just want to bring up on December 3rd in Sacramento, we're going to have our first accessible financing workshop. Ultimately, if we're going to have any success in building electrification, there's got to be financing programs that are accessible to a wide range of renters as well as building owners. And so we've hired a fantastic team led by Dr. Holmes Hummel and Jean Clinton and Bruce Mast to help work with us on proposals for California that we can all work on implementing together. And we're having our first workshop in that series on December 3rd in Sacramento. And so you can go to the Building Decarbonization Coalition's website. You can see on the screen, buildingdecarb.org. Scroll to the bottom of the homepage to see our calendar to find more information about each of these different events and how you can register for them. We are a membership-based organization. Many of you on the call are already members. Thank you for that. And those that aren't, we would welcome your membership to come in. This is a forum where we're bringing together all the different parts of the community to have conversations on solutions. And it's a great opportunity for you to be able to discuss, debate, and engage with some of the other thought leaders in this space. So thank you for that. And with that, we'll kick it over to today's call. So what we're going to do is we've just done the introductions and the welcome. We're going to have Rachel from Sierra Club give some background on Title 24-22 update and also the measures of decarbonization interests that are in the 2022 update. Then Ted and Rachel are going to give some of the details on some of the areas of particular interest for the decarbonization community. And then we'll have a summary and next steps, which will include the next steps of the coalition offering some talking points to the community that you can consider using in your submittals to the Energy Commission to take part in the process. This webinar is being recorded and will be posted on the Building Decarbonization Coalition's website in the members section, which is still currently open to everybody until the end of this year. And you are all on mute, but we will have an opportunity to ask questions at the end. So please use the chat function in order to ask questions, and I'll read them at the end for people to be able to answer. There's just too many people to unmute everybody. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Rachel. And Rachel, you just tell me when you want to advance slides. Thank you all very much for joining, and I'll talk to you again at the end.
Terrific. Thanks so much. So there's five main, this is Rachel from the Sierra Club, and there's 5 main key points that we really want to convey in this webinar. Which are our recommendations to the California Energy Commission on how they should adjust their approach to the 2022 building standards. So, and we're going to come back to these points in greater detail throughout this webinar. So the first is that we recommend that the CEC use an all-electric baseline for the building code compliance to align with building decarbonization goals. The second is we support the new source energy metric, which is a new metric that's been proposed for the 2022 code, which we'll get into. The third is our recommendation to update TDV, time-dependent valuation, to reward load flexibility technologies and demand response. The fourth key point is to align TDV and the source energy metric underlying assumptions and inputs with the state's climate goals. And then the fifth is around non-combustion emissions. So both adjusting the methane leakage rate and also their assumptions around the global warming potential of refrigerants in heat pumps. So those are the 5 key things that we came away with from the metrics workshops that we think needs to get adjusted to support building decarbonization in the code. There's definitely a lot of other issues to bring up. So if you have ideas that are not on this list, please jot that down so we can talk about it after the presentation. If you can go to the next slide, Panama. Great, so last month the CEC hosted a workshop on metrics for the 2022 standards. Great workshop in Sacramento. And in that workshop, they laid out what their goals are for the 2022 standards. And we were really pleased to see that their primary goal is to focus on building decarbonization in this code cycle, not just zero net electricity or zero net energy. Their second goal is to support a resilient building envelope, so resiliency for homes in both heating and cooling climates, and also to encourage self-utilization of on-site solar and demand response, which is definitely needed for the grid. And then they have a number of goals of things they don't want to do. So they don't want to increase stringency for residential buildings in this code cycle. They're proposing to do that in the 2025 code cycle. So that's something that we should definitely discuss as a community. The fourth thing is they, of course, want to avoid federal preemption, and they're proposing to do this by using source energy as a proxy for greenhouse gas emissions. And then the fifth goal is, of course, not to increase energy costs for building occupants. So these are the things that we need to keep in mind when we're commenting to the CEC to help them stay aligned with these goals and to achieve them. We can go to the next slide, Panama. Great, so let me first share some updated metrics and updated approaches that the CEC is proposing for this code cycle. So the first thing that's new is that they introduced a new metric. So they introduced a source energy metric, and they did this to align buildings with decarbonization policies and their decarbonization goals. So, and they're proposing to use basically two independent metrics for code compliance. The first is this hourly source energy metric, which they're referring to as EDR1. And basically this is a GHG proxy budget. The unit is kBTU per square feet per year. And it's based on long run marginal greenhouse gas emissions. And again, it's really to get to the decarbonization goal. The second metric is TDV, which I'm sure you're all familiar with if you've been engaged in the building code process before, and that's referred to as EDR2. And so the CEC is saying we cannot trade off between these two metrics. You need to meet both the EDR1 and the EDR2 requirements. And I would say just a reminder that the TDV or the EDR2 requirement, the goal is basically to protect the building envelope and to maintain grid harmonization signals, and it's a cost effectiveness metric. In terms of TDV, and Ted is going to get into this in greater detail, just a reminder that it is an hourly energy cost metric. It incorporates, in that bullet, it lists all the different inputs. It incorporates marginal generation, T&D, fuel capacity losses, etc. It's very important to note that even though they've updated this metric, it still favors gas or mixed fuel buildings over all electric designs, primarily because of the lower retail cost of gas in the assumptions. So further updates are going to be needed to this metric if we're going to support building decarbonization. And then the last, and this has been a little bit vague and we're trying to get more clarity on it, but it sounds like the CEC is proposing separate baselines. So a separate baseline for mixed fuel and a separate baseline for all electric buildings, which is what they did in the 2019 code cycle for low-rise residential. Let's go to the next slide, please. And again, Ted is going to get into this more, but I wanted just to share what this TDV update actually looks like. So basically, the black line is the TDV value from the 2019 code cycle, and then the lines in color are the 2022 code cycle. And I apologize, there's a typo in the header. It should say 2019 and 2022. That's my fault. So you can see the main difference is that there's a slight dip in TDV in the afternoon with the new TDV metric. The peak is a little bit lower in the evening, and there's a little bit more of a peak in the morning. So it does encourage some sort of, it does show the difference in using electricity at different times of the day, but it's still not a strong enough signal to really encourage demand response technologies. So just wanted to flag that, and Ted is going to get into this more. Go to the next slide, please. And beneath this TDV metric and the source energy metric, there is many assumptions and inputs. And I wanted to share a few of those. There's lots more, so we're not going to get into all of them, but here are the key things that are really influencing these metrics. And the first thing to flag is also that the CEC has added new weather files to reflect global warming in the 2022 performance software. So we're going to see what effect that has on the code. The second is they added a new input for the global warming potential of refrigerant leakage in heat pumps and ACs, as well as methane leakage from the gas system. The third new input is they assumed a decarbonization goal of 80% GHG reduction below 1990 levels by 2050. And all these inputs are things that we have actually an issue with, which we're going to get into later in the webinar. So I'm just flagging them now. The fourth is they also assume that there is renewable natural gas or decarbonized pipeline fuels in the gas system by 2030. And they assume rather high levels, 10% biomethane by 2030, ramping up to nearly 20% by 2050, as well as renewable hydrogen blended in with fossil gas by 2050. The next is they actually assume a slower building electrification scenario than we expected. So they took E3's slow or low building electrification scenario, which basically assumes about 18% of homes are electrified by 2030 and about 49% by 2050. And we're going to discuss in a bit why this is problematic. Lots more inputs and assumptions. If others want to flag other things on the end of the call, that would be great as well. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Ted to get into more of the metrics and the baseline, and then we'll come back and get into the assumptions more.
Thanks, Rachel. Everybody hear me okay?
Yep, hear you great.
All right, great. So I wanted to give you guys a couple of resources here just really quickly. If you're getting up to speed with what's changed in 2019 code, there's a link there for the Energy Code ACE resources that gives kind of line by line what's changed between 2016 and 2019. So if you click ahead, that'll take you to the second link, which is the stakeholders meetings that are coming up for different measures they're proposing for 2022. So that metrics workshop was one of the first things that they rolled out for the 2022 cycle. But look out for these case measures because this is what they're proposing to add. And if you'll click again, there's some interesting things here for grid integration. So it's got some proposals for adding compliance options for enabled load shifting. And if you're interested in indoor agriculture, they're planning to regulate some of the indoor cultivation environments that have come online recently. There's a big energy impact they want to start regulating too. So keep an eye on stakeholders.com and look at resources there. So go ahead, Panama. So just a quick primer on time-dependent valuation of energy, really understanding that this metric's been in place since the 2005 code, and these are just the peak multipliers over the time period for the 2005, 2008 code, 2013, 2016 mapped here, and 2019. You can see that how those multipliers have shifted over time over those code cycles. To really reflect what's going on peak demand and the shift towards that large peak demand in the evening hours now in that ramping period to match the duck. So go ahead and click forward. And like we showed here, the 2019 to 2022 impacts are pretty significant in shifting the midday peak a little bit lower. But if you click forward, Panama, there's this challenge here with the dampening effect from the retail adjustments. And this is one thing that Pierre from NRDC pointed out, that there's no time of use retail adjustments that would impact this curve overall. And that flat adder is something we're concerned with because that doesn't really reflect the total retail adjustment that users would see. And if you click forward, later in the E3 study, they actually identified both a seasonal and daily impact of energy use in that retail hour. So that needs to be really reflected in that flat adder, and that's something we were concerned about with that TDV metric, with that flat rate adder. It really just dampens the effect of the TDV multiplier in the daytime. I'm going to go ahead and click forward. So again, TDV metrics for natural gas, they don't really reflect a daily change. It's more about a seasonal change. And you can see the impact from the 2019, 2016 TDVs for both natural gas and propane. Seasonal changes are based on seasonal delivery of propane and natural gas, not on the daily like we have electricity. And that really reflects a lot of the discrepancies between the mixed fuel comparison to the all-electric design and the challenge for those TDV multipliers. But they did add in those cap and trade emissions, those emission abatements, and even some T&D multipliers that change that profile and increases it. There's a good increase here, but again, we don't have that daily or impact like we have for electricity. So go ahead and click through. So let's talk about the new metric. So there's an alternative metric called time-dependent source energy. And we need to be really careful about the metrics that we use here to get out of that preemption issue. And the way they've done this is to use source energy, but on an hourly basis. And when you really match these up, it reflects the carbon impacts pretty closely. And what E3 is showing here is that they've actually taken the short-run source energy profile and combined it with the renewable energy profiles based on our progression of renewable portfolio standards, progressions towards more renewables on the grid. So they've combined these factors into this long-range source energy multiplier that will predict out the greening of the grid and the hourly impact still for time-dependent source. So this is actually a really good positive metric that will take into account over this code cycle some of the progression of the renewable energy coming onto the grid. So go ahead and click forward. And that kind of gives you another look into this. So these source energy multipliers in the middle of the day, in the middle of the year where we've got solar access, you can see that time-dependent source energy factor recognizes the availability of solar on the grid. And then in those later seasons, going into December, January, out in those colder hours, we recognize that we still have a lot of carbon sources in that source energy factor accounted for in that metric. So that will give us an hourly window into those source energy and carbon impacts. So go ahead. The challenge being that in the retail natural gas projections, that time-dependent source on the gas side actually does include a significant amount of biogas and almost the maximum potential of biogas going out to the 2049, 2050 period. So they're taking into account a zero global warming potential, or CO2e, for the blended biogas and hydrogen over time. So you can see that, and that is what I personally believe is kind of the theoretical maximum that we can achieve, which is a challenge, I believe. So go ahead and click forward. So this does take into account some leakage in the natural gas system and what gets into the transmission and distribution system, and some behind the meter leakage as well. So if you click forward, this doesn't really account for what we're flaring off in methane production and gas production in, say, the western states right now. This is really just talking about the leakage within the delivery system, not the full, I would say, source impact of fuel production and methane delivery. So go ahead and click forward one more time. So again, looking at the mid-IPER applications, we do have that full source energy down to 80%. In other words, accounting for 20% of both biogas and hydrogen coming into that delivery. So go ahead and click forward. So again, just one more metric that E3 put out showing that reduction of natural gas, that credit that they're getting almost towards 20% of the biofuels. So go ahead and click forward. And one more time. So the leakage rates, and I think Rachel's going to talk about this a little bit more further on, they're assuming that 0.7 leakage rate, and we have a firm understanding that there is a lot more leakage in the system that we need to be accounting for in that. So go ahead and click forward. So the 2022 standards assume separate gas and electric baselines as the 2019 code does for residential buildings. This matters because we've got a fuel-neutral baseline for low-rise residential and multifamily low-rise residential buildings. That time-dependent source metric and the TDV metrics are compared equally. So if you've got an electrified building, you're getting compared to electrified building. The challenge right now is this is not planned to happen on the non-residential side of the equation. And that standard gas baseline that we get compared to is really handed down to ASHRAE 90.1 alignment. And so that we need to recommend to the CEC that they do introduce a fuel-neutral baseline, either by overriding the ASHRAE 90.1 system mapping or inventing their own what gives us a fair electrification baseline, so that that effectiveness of the time-dependent valuation metric and the time-dependent source metric gets compared back equally to your fuel choice, at least for the interim. Go ahead and click forward. So again, we're talking about that EDR1, which is hourly source energy, and the EDR2 being time-dependent valuation. Currently, they're showing no trade-off between that, which is fine for the fuel-neutral baseline in the residential and low-rise residential. But if we can't show compliance on time-dependent valuation versus a gas baseline on the non-residential side, we're not going to be able to show compliance, period. So go ahead and click through. And just to remind everybody, we've got a lot of these issues coming through right now because of these code comparisons for non-residential buildings for our local REACH code adoption. And this is happening for UC as well, as they have their decarbonization policy already put in place. So this is an issue for non-residential buildings. Residential buildings we have a good solution for, and I personally want to encourage the Energy Commission to do that same good work for the non-residential buildings. So.
Great, thank you, Ted. And I'm going to talk about 5 other areas where we think the 2022 code can be improved in terms of the assumptions that impact both TDV and the source energy metric. So those 5 key areas are the assumptions around climate targets, the assumed building electrification scenario, the assumed amount of the supply of RNG in the pipeline, the methane leakage rates, and then the global warming potential of refrigerants and heat pumps appliances. So let's go to the next slide. So the first is the climate target. The 2022 standards assume a very old climate target of 80% GHG reduction by 2050. This does not reflect the executive order that Brown instated last year at the Global Climate Action Summit of carbon neutrality economy-wide by 2045. And this climate target also doesn't reflect IPCC or climate science. So it's important that if our goal is decarbonization, that we have the right decarbonization target, and that we're all working towards the same goal, and that our building code aligns with our statewide policy. This also impacts TDV and the price signal for electrification. So we encourage you to ask the CEC to update their climate target to reflect the carbon neutrality goal for 2045. The next slide, please. Great, and this brings us to the building electrification scenario. So as I said earlier, the 2022 standards assume E3's slower building electrification scenario. So about 18% of homes electrified by 2030, a little less than 50% by 2050. So this is a really important one. First of all, it doesn't reflect any of the electrification progress that we've seen in the last 6 months. You all are familiar, we've got 14 cities that have, 13 or 14 cities that have adopted building electrification codes that either mandate or strongly encourage all electric new construction. We're seeing a lot of progress at the PUC and at other state agencies to bring incentives and other programs that are going to transform the market and electrify buildings much faster. And it also doesn't reflect the level of electrification that's even needed to achieve our climate goals. Doesn't reflect the level that has been identified by E3. And really importantly, what this actually does is by assuming a slower level of building electrification, it sends the wrong price signal. So it basically keeps the gas price lower in TDV out to 2050. If you look at E3's Future of Gas report, you'll see that as you assume a higher level of building electrification, gas rates are projected to increase significantly. And that also, obviously reflects reality more, and this is also going to improve the cost effectiveness of all electric new construction. So this is important not just in terms of sort of climate science and reflecting the movement that we're seeing across the state, but also to get the price signal right and to get TDV to be more accurate. So we're recommending to the CEC that they assume E3's faster building electrification scenario. And I note that this scenario also aligns with the building decarbonization roadmap and goals. So 50% of new sales of water heaters and HVAC are heat pumps by 2030, 100% by 2050. Great, and the next is on RNG supply, which Ted touched on. So again, the standards assume about 10% biomethane by 2030, nearly 20% by 2050. And then also blending in renewable hydrogen with fossil gas by 2050. It's really important to note that they assume that this level of RNG is going to have zero methane leakage and be fuel neutral. Be carbon neutral. We know that's not accurate. There's leakage in the gas system, and whether it's RNG that's leaking or fossil gas, there's going to be that's still methane going into the atmosphere with a very high global warming potential. So we're concerned at both the quantity of biomethane that's assumed to be in the pipeline system, as well as their lack of accounting for the climate impacts of that RNG actually leaking. So why does this matter? It matters because it basically results in a muted price signal, which could lead to building designers and building owners choosing a more expensive and higher emission option. So basically mixed fuel buildings that uses a marginal amount of RNG. And it also assumes that the RNG supply, it also assumes a very generous amount of RNG supply, which we don't think is actually realistic in California, and that all of that RNG supply is going to be used to electrify buildings rather than other sectors like heavy duty industry, which are much harder and more costly to electrify. So the recommendation is that the CEC adjust the RNG assumptions because they're currently unrealistic. And we can provide, when we follow up, with a bunch of sources, including NREL and others, who show much lower levels of RNG in the state. Just want to point out also that the current share is less than 1%. Biogas is very expensive. There's limited supply. And there's also no policies in place that are going to get us anywhere near 10% by 2030. So those are things to keep in mind. The next is on methane leakage, which Ted also touched on as well. And I would say this is definitely the Sierra Club's perspective. I'm not sure if this is the BDC perspective as a whole. So, let's have a discussion on this. First, the 2022 standards assume that methane has a 100-year global warming potential of 25. Many other organizations and experts assume 20-year GWP of 86. So that's something to discuss. They also assume a very low leakage rate of 0.7%. They do that to align with CARB. This is even lower than the federal EPA's leakage rate of 1.5%, which is already quite low. And then, as I mentioned, they assume no leakage for RNG. So this is important because this impacts the TDV metric and the source energy metric, which is going to trigger code compliance or not. So our recommendation to the CEC is that the 2022 standards should align with climate science and not just other agencies that are slow to update their assumptions. We believe we should use a shorter time frame for methane because it's only in the atmosphere for 12 years. So the 20-year global warming potential of 86 will be much better than the 100-year global warming potential of 25. There's also a range of studies out there on what the actual methane leakage rate is. One that's been very accepted is the Alvarez EDF study that came out last year, showing about 2.3% methane leakage. I note that this 2.3% leakage is all before the meter. There's recent studies by LB&L of behind the meter leakage of around 0.5%. So, this could potentially be added together around 2.8%. But we know there needs to be at least 1.5 or much greater than that, not 0.7%. As well as remembering that biomethane and blended hydrogen can also leak and release methane. That should be included in the source energy metric for RNG and gas as well. And then the last is around refrigerant global warming potential assumptions. So the 2022 standards assume very high refrigerant global warming potential. You can see that in the first chart. And it is good that they're including this because this is going to impact the greenhouse gas emissions. The concern is that they're not including, or does not seem like the CEC is including, lower GWP refrigerant alternatives, including heat pump models that may have a GWP of 1 if they use CO2 as a refrigerant. So we're concerned that this poses a risk of inflating the greenhouse gas emissions of all electric when we know that the market for low GWP heat pumps is quickly evolving, and then there's policies in place to help bring these lower global warming potential heat pumps to the market. So the recommendation to the CEC is that their assumption should really include this technological innovation and market transformation that we're going to see, and to have a GWP of these appliances decline over the life of the building, and to not assume that these higher refrigerant GWP appliances are going to be in the building for the building's lifetime. So we need to take into account all the policies, both international and the state protocols, and all the work that's being done to transform the market to these lower GWP heat pump appliances. And I think that's all of my slides. Pamela, do you want to do next steps, or would you like me to?
Yep. Yeah, I'll be happy to.
Great.
So thank you both very much, Ted and Rachel. Man, really, really well done. A lot of material in a short amount of time, and I really appreciate it. So this is Panama again with the Building Decarbonization Coalition. As those of you who take part in the coalition know, we are a 501c3 and nonprofit, so we do not do any lobbying. So all of our public policy activities are efforts to engage and educate both stakeholders and policymakers around issues of policies that relate to building decarbonization. And so the coalition doesn't directly submit comments into the Energy Commission or any other proceeding. What we seek to do is try to elevate the conversation, bring up the topics related to building decarbonization, and then try to give people tools that they can then use to take part in the public policy discussions. And so this webinar has covered what we thought are the most critical issues on building decarbonization in the 2022 update. And following up on this, next week, we're going to be sending around some talking points that relate to the points that Ted and Rachel made on behalf of the coalition that you can use in your submission to the Energy Commission's process. It's very easy to submit comments to the Energy Commission. And what we'll be doing is we'll be sending around both the talking points and then directions about step-by-step how to submit the comments into the Energy Commission. So that'll come out next Wednesday. Comments are due by the 30th of November. So you have plenty of time to use our talking points, to put it onto your letterhead and get your logo on there. Talk to us if you have any questions, and then be able to submit it by the 30th using the instructions that we'll send around. And so, so that should be coming out from us next Wednesday. And at this point, we're going to start with any questions that folks have. And I'm going to start with one from Heidi Werner. And she asks, during the Energy Commission's website on October 17th, E3 indicated that assuming the slower building electrification scenario actually sends a stronger signal for the 2022 cycle that we should be encouraging electrification. So counterintuitively, the slower electrification scenario is actually what we want to assume if our goal is to encourage all electric buildings. Did Ted or Rachel dig into E3's justifications for using the slower electrification scenario?
Can you say a little more about, I guess we're not doing it back and forth. I personally did not dig into the reason for why E3 used that scenario, but I do believe if you look at the future of gas study and the pathways analysis, where they show the two different scenarios, that if you go to the higher building electrification scenario, the gas rates go up dramatically, and that is going to impact TDV and help us on the TDV side, on the building electrification side. But I'm very curious to hear more about how a slower building electrification scenario could be helpful.
Heidi, I just unmuted you if you want to add anything to your question. Oops, you're really faint. We can't hear you. So I'm going to mute you again, and then let me know if you want to speak at all. Tom Cabot writes, it appears the Energy Commission is not recognizing risk differences between counting on magic RNG and then it not arriving to fuel the equipment they allowed. So more of a comment than a question. Any other questions? There was a robust conversation on chat instigated by Sean Armstrong from Redwood Energy about a number of points in here, but particularly around the graph used for the TDR. Any other questions from folks about what was presented or the next steps? A question from Rushi, does the update apply to rehabs in the multifamily sector?
Panama, is the question, will these TDV multipliers impact retrofitted buildings? Anything that's going to be underneath the energy code will be impacted by these electrification scenarios and the time-dependent valuation compliance pathways. I'm not sure if I understood the question right.
Yeah, let me find Rushi, and then Rushi, I'm going to unmute you and allow you to ask your question. You're unmuted now if you want to ask your question.
Hear me now?
Yep, we can.
Hey, thank you for taking the question. We are right now at TNDC doing a rehab project. So I wanted to understand if these changes would be applicable for rehabs as well that will be applying for Title 24.
So in that scenario, if you're showing compliance for either 2019 or 2022 code at the time, the impacts for Title 24 would be reflected in any compliance approach, unless you're doing prescriptive upgrades. If you're going through the performance approach, these metrics will impact your compliance approach.
Got it. Okay. Thank you.
And also just a note that this code cycle goes into effect January 1, 2023. So in 4 more years.
We got a while. Yep. Perhaps more of a philosophical question, but I'll ask it nonetheless. Why, oops, got done. From Chris Stolstrup, why are things so skewed to support RNG? Is this the last gasp from the fossil fuel industry? At some point, is it going to be illegal to burn things on Earth? No question mark.
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I mean, I think the gas industry has made a lot of progress on pushing RNG. We definitely have a methane issue from landfills and from dairies. And the question is, how is that leaking methane going to be used? Are we going to reduce the existence of it? Are we going to use it for sectors that are harder to electrify? Or are we going to use it for buildings? So that's still an open question. But I do think that the gas industry has really pushed this forward very hard. And the environmental community and others, I think, are doing a good job trying to keep us based in the facts. And we need to keep doing that at both the PUC and the CEC.
Great. From Tom Cabot, can the Energy Commission do the cost effectiveness study for additions and remodels that are unable to avoid the cost of gas hookups like new buildings can?
I think I can address that question if I understand it right. The cost effectiveness analysis that was for new construction, Tom, had both the low cost of connection for natural gas, assuming the gas is in the street. They didn't do it specifically for additions or remodels, though. They probably can do that, but it's a little bit trickier of equation. But they did, in that cost effectiveness report for 2019, have the high cost of a new trunk line being added to a community, that high, like $25,000 cost, versus just the smaller cost of adding gas from the street into the building was that big range in that cost effectiveness. Probably apply that to additions and remodels, but they didn't do that specifically for new construction.
Al Sung wants to know if there's any discussion you're hearing about rewards or mandates, so like compliance credits or mandates for schools to include battery storage with photovoltaics and optimizing systems.
You know, the 2022 code really didn't address at all for commercial buildings PV or battery storage in the equations that I've seen. That grid harmonization proposal that I alluded to in the case study may take into account some of that, but right now they don't have any functionality or capability to credit either PV or battery storage for non-residential buildings in this code cycle update.
There's a couple, I think, more suggestions rather than questions from folks on the chat that I'll leave for folks to read around building types and the speed of adoption, and just keep to some of the technical questions. From Neil Bulger, there was 2 gas forecast scenarios presented which would be used in either the source or TDV metric. Is there an opinion from either of you on the better of these 2 for the industry?
Neil, just to clarify, was that the difference between the propane and natural gas comparisons? Because there has been some discussion on whether to use that propane that is a higher impact than natural gas when doing an all-electric building as an interim solution.
Now, there was a slide on like a policy-based forecast for gas, and then another one called mid-IPER, I believe. And they kind of used 2 different reports, one from the CPUC and one from the CEC on the future of gas, and they resulted in different TDVs for the 2. So it seemed like they just left it open and asked, they kind of gave results for both and said, maybe this doesn't matter, but I thought it might matter. So
yeah, you know what? Let's dig into that a little bit more, because I didn't go into too much detail on that in my review, but I'll go back and look at it and perhaps include something in my comment. So let's coordinate on that, would you?
Sure.
And I think we also need to make sure that whichever gas retail rate scenario the CEC goes with, that it should ideally include the recent gas rate increases approved by the PUC for the utilities as well.
Yeah, one did and one didn't, I think. So that might be the biggest thing. So.
Thanks for flagging that.
And then from Tom Cabot, last night at a council meeting on REACH codes, the council did not want to require electrification in additions and remodels because there was 0 gas connection dollar savings to make electrification cost effective. So we have an analysis gap that potentially the commission can help fill. Any other questions that folks have? You can either unmute yourself or you can ask via chat, and we'll take it to 1 more minute if there's nothing new coming in. But once again, what we will be doing is we will be providing comments for you to consider in a letter format next week with some of the resources that those are based on, such as what Rachel mentioned, some of the studies around methane leakage that you can consider submitting to the Energy Commission by November 30th with directions about how to submit those comments. And we look forward to any feedback you have or anything else you think needs to be added to the list of recommended changes. This is the first of what will be a number of webinars that the coalition will host on this topic, bringing in different speakers to talk about the most recent updates and the state of negotiations, and then how people can get involved in recommendations on involvement. So I'm not seeing anything new come in. And so at this point, I'm going to bring this webinar to a close. Thank you all so much for attending. And I hope that you go onto the Building Decarbonization Coalition's website, become a member so that you can be notified about future webinars like this and take part in some of our many forums on the different topics related to building decarbonization. Thank you to Ted and Rachel for the presentation. Thank you to Kayla Robinson from Energy and Environmental Consulting for the support. And thank you all for coming to the workshop and for being an active voice in the proceedings that are really going to determine whether we can decarbonize California's buildings. Have a great weekend, everybody, and keep decarbonizing out there.